AD 247, August. Citizens in the imperial capital were celebrating the 1000th anniversary of the founding of Rome. As I mentioned in the last episode, it was probably the case that the crowds, despite their drinking and feasting, their attendance of gladiatorial games and chariot races, may have had a looming suspicion that the best days of Rome were in the past. Rome was in the midst of the crisis of the 3rd century. Germanic tribes were overrunning the Danube. The relationship with the Sassanids, the new rulers of Persia, was on the rocks, and it seemed like a large-scale war in the east, at the same time as western provinces were being overrun, was inevitable. And as it turns out, things would become worse the following year. In 248, soldiers in the central provinces of Pannonia and Moesia rebelled and proclaimed a new emperor. A pestilence would sweep through the Roman Empire, adding to the calamities of war, economic instability, and social upheaval. The crisis of the 3rd century continues on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 75, The Plague of Cyprian. Despite celebrating the 1000th anniversary of Rome in 247, the Emperor Philip had a real hot mess on his hands. As I mentioned in the introduction, many of the Roman provinces faced grave threats to their security. Rebellions around the Danube, tensions with the Sassanians in the east, and now in 248, a mutiny and a usurping would-be emperor rose to prominence just a few hundred miles from Italy in Pannonia. Sources for this period, which are not very reliable, suggest that Philip may have even attempted to call it quits, that he was so overwhelmed with the quantity and quality of the problems before him that he thought somebody else might be better off managing this mess. The Senate, however, refused. None of them certainly wanted the job. One of his most vocal supporters was the senator Decius, a man who was himself from the area near the Danube, a former consul and governor in the west, who had recently served as urban prefect at the beginning of Philip's reign in 243. Philip decided that Decius would be a key ally in his effort to restore order in the Roman provinces. And so Decius was sent with several legions to quell the rebellion and to put down the usurper in Pannonia. Decius was successful enough in his mission that not only did the soldiers cease to support the usurper, they decided that Decius himself actually would make a pretty good emperor. And in the spring of 249 AD, they pledged their personal loyalty to Decius. And with this now much larger army, he began the march toward Rome. Philip became desperate. The ally that he had turned to help him with the problem nearest to him had now become a problem himself, and a much bigger one. Philip started spending as much money as he could, trying to buy support from the soldiers nearby. Philip, however, did not have any additional silver to pass out, so he substantially debased the Roman silver coinage, passing out a coin that was probably little more than 5% silver and almost entirely composed of debased copper. At the same time, and this is all happening in the spring of 249, Philip got word that riots had broken out in Egypt, threatening the grain supply to Rome. The grain ships from Alexandria normally arrived in late spring or early summer, and it seemed like they were not going to come. In addition to having a usurper at his back door, a monetary system in ruins, Philip was now facing the near certainty of food riots in Rome as well. Philip decided to cast the dice, marching the army that he could muster out to meet Decius in northern Italy. Decius won the battle decisively. Philip was killed, along with his only son, and the Roman Empire now had a new emperor, Decius, who added the name of one of Rome's greatest emperors to his own, that of the Emperor Trajan. And so now, in mid-249, we have the reign of Trajan Decius. It seems like Decius understood that there was a lot of trepidation both in the city of Rome and in the wider empire. For the Romans, So many calamities at once was an obvious sign that the gods were displeased. As emperor, it was up to Decius to propose and then implement the rituals that would placate the gods and set up the next 1,000 years of Rome as one of success. Unfortunately for Trajan Decius, in mid to late 249, a pestilence broke out in the provinces of the Roman Empire and began making its way towards Rome. The Christian historian Paulus Orosius tells us, quote, "There reached a pestilence of extraordinary diseases. There was almost no province of Rome, no city, no house, which was not attacked and emptied by this general plague." That's Paulus Orosius's History Against the Pagans. We don't know a lot about this disease. My colleague Kyle Harper has written about this disease, suggesting that it was a true pandemic that swept across the Roman Empire, killing millions. Other historians think that it was localized to just a few provinces and was otherwise not a big deal. The literary sources certainly describe it as devastating. And the reason it's called the Plague of Cyprian is because the African bishop, Cyprian of Carthage, had a lot to say about it. One of Cyprian's sermons speaks about some of the symptoms of the disease. He talks about a pain in the eyes, attack of the fevers, and the ailments of the limbs. He says the strength of the body is dissolved, the bowels dissipate in a flow, the fire that begins in the inmost depths burns up into wounds in the throat, the intestines are shaken with continuous vomiting, the eyes are set on fire from the force of blood, and the infection of the deadly putrefaction cuts off the feet or other extremities. Weakness prevails through the failures and losses of the bodies. The gait is crippled, and the hearing is blocked. The vision is blinded. That's Cyprian's On Mortality, as translated in Kyle Harper's book, The Fate of Rome, which I definitely recommend you read. The symptoms described by Cyprian could fit any number of diseases, and historians don't know to this day what disease was behind it. Kyle Harper expected pandemic influenza as one possibility. The second, some form of filovirus like Ebola. Either way, the disease took the Roman Empire by storm. We don't know how many people it killed, but I agree with Harper about the pandemic nature of this biological event. For Cyprian, the disease was one of many signs. Not only that the world was falling apart, in fact, he speaks of the world dying, but that the judgment of God was coming. And this plague, along with the wars and everything else, were signs that God was going to judge the earth soon. Inhabitants of the Roman world ought to turn to him or face a much more severe judgment than just sickness, war, and economic crisis. This is what Cyprian says in a letter that he wrote to the governor of his province. Quote, "The world itself is now speaking and giving witness to its death with the evidence of general decay. Wars continue to be even more frequent. Sterility and hunger heighten disquiet. Ghastly illness ravages men's health. The human race is devastated by rampaging decay. Fewer veins of marble are wrenched from the scarred and exhausted mountains, and worked-out mines provide fewer sources of silver and gold. The farmer diminishes and weakens in the fields, the sailor at sea, the soldiers in camp. This is the sentence that the world passes. It is the law of God that everything that is born dies. Everything that once grew grows old. Everything strong grows weak. Everything great declines, and when it has become weak and slight, it is finished." That's Cyprian's letter to Demetrianus. Cyprian's letter shows us that there were competing views about how to interpret the crisis of the 3rd century, and especially the Plague of Cyprian. For Christians, the pestilence was in some ways an act of mercy, a warning shot fired from God to encourage sinful humanity to repent and turn to the one true God and his Son, Jesus Christ. For Romans, however, the interpretation was the other way around. The God's displeasure was evident through the plague and the wars and the suffering. right worship of the gods, the correct rituals and sacrifices needed to be reinstituted across the entire empire, and any who didn't comply ought to be punished. This, as it turns out, was the view that persuaded the emperor Trajan Decius. And around 250 AD, perhaps less than a year into the Plague of Cyprian, the emperor issued the most ambitious religious decree in all of Roman history. Trajan Decius commanded that every single inhabitant of the Roman Empire sacrifice to the traditional Roman gods. Moreover, they must do so in the presence of witnesses, and their sacrifice must be verified by an official and recorded on a certificate. As it turns out, we have several surviving copies of such certificates. All of them are from Egypt, where the dry, arid weather preserved papyrus certificates. One of them was filled out on behalf of a 72-year-old man named Aurelius Diogenes, and it contains the standard boilerplate language that a lot of these sacrifice certificates must have had. And I'm going to tell you what that says. Quote, "I have always sacrificed regularly to the gods, and now, in your presence, in accordance with the edict, I have done sacrifice, and poured out the drink offering, and tasted of the sacrifices, and I request you to certify the same." The document is then signed by an official called the Commissioner of Sacrifice, presumably a local official designated to verify sacrifices in Aurelius Diogenes' village. Now, it's probably not the case that Trajan Decius aimed this edict at Christians, but of course, Christians' unwillingness to participate in pagan rituals would have been exposed in this empire-wide order. And so while I don't think of this edict as the first systemic empire-wide Christian persecution, it is probably the most important step in marginalizing Christians and making it clear that they were to be, from now on, an object of focused, official, empire-wide persecution. Cyprian himself comments upon the sudden, intense hostility towards Christians that arose at this time. In his writings on plague, he says this, quote, "The plague has accomplished this for Christians and the servants of God, that we have begun gladly to seek martyrdom while we are learning not to fear death. These are trying exercises for us, not deaths. They give to the mind the glory of fortitude. By contempt of death, they prepare for the crown." Cyprian in many ways is echoing the writings of Paul in the New Testament, that the Christian life is like a race. At the same time as one makes progress, as one is sanctified, as one accelerates towards one's heavenly home, they also endure the sufferings and trials of the race itself. For Cyprian, death from the plague and the martyrdoms that followed were like a final sprint, the most exhausting part of the race before the finish line. We know from other sources that Christians embraced this role, sacrificing themselves, whether it was in caring for the sick or in proclaiming their allegiance to Jesus Christ. In his ecclesiastical history, the Christian historian Eusebius wrote extensively on the church's activities in the age of the Cyprianic plague. And he notes a marked contrast between non-Christians and Christians in the way that they handled the fear and panic that sprung out across the entire Roman Empire. First, Eusebius says, quote, "The pagans separated themselves from those who began to fall ill. They fled from those dearest to them. They even threw them in the roads half dead and treated the unburied dead like garbage." End quote. But of the Christians, this is what Eusebius goes on to say, quote, "They took up the bodies of the saints with welcoming hands and bosoms, cleaned them, and closed their eyes and mouths, placed them on their shoulders, and laid them down. They clung to them, wrapped themselves around them, and adorned them with washings and funeral wrappings, and a short time later, they received the same, for those left behind always followed those who died before them." That's Eusebius's Ecclesiastical History, Book 7. Now, a Christian author like Eusebius is going to highlight the positive response of the Christians and the negative response of the non-Christians. But we know from many other sources both Christian and non-Christian, that Christians were often found running towards the sick and the vulnerable in times of crisis. And it wouldn't be surprising if what Eusebius describes of the Cyprianic plague is true. Certainly it reflects Cyprian's own comments on what the plague and the wider persecutions of the time represent in terms of an opportunity for Christians to live out their faith. And so while the Plague of Cyprian can be read as yet another devastating chapter in the crisis of the 3rd century, it is also, in many ways, a crucial moment in the rise of Christianity. While Christians died in the pestilence just like everybody else, and Eusebius verifies that, they died in a way which drew attention to their cause and won converts to their faith. And in less than half a century from the Plague of Cyprian, we will see the church go from a persecuted minority religion in the Roman Empire to an approved public religion that won the adherence of the Roman Emperor Constantine. But before we get to his story, we will need to cover the most dramatic political shakeup in the Roman Empire yet: the severing of the Roman Empire into 3 separatist states. That is the subject of the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocore. Follow Dr. Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.